The year was 1876, and the Arizona Territory was a land baked into patience. It did not hurry. The sun rose and set in its own time, a painter working with a single palette of red, ochre, and violet. Great mesas stood like the broken teeth of gods in the long sweep of the desert, their shadows stretching like ink spills across the sand. This was Monument Valley, a place of profound silence, where the only sound was the patient scraping of the wind against the ribs of saguaro cacti and the whisper of dust devils dancing themselves into oblivion. Herds of wild horses, ghosts of muscle and mane, moved like a single, flowing thought across the horizon, their hoofbeats swallowed by the immense quiet. Into this silence rode a man who was made of it. Tawa Bodaway was his name, though he had not heard it spoken aloud in a long time. He was Navajo, a Dine, one of the people. But he was a man adrift, cut loose from the anchor of his tribe. He rode a lean pinto that knew the land as well as he did, its steps sure and economical. War had been his life, a bitter trade he had learned from the white soldiers and the Apache alike. It had carved lines into his face that had nothing to do with age and put a stillness in his dark eyes that was deeper than the desert sky. A fresh scar, still pink and puckered, traced a map of pain along his ribs, a reminder of the fight he had just left behind. It was not the only wound he carried. The deeper ones, the ones that festered in the soul, were what had driven him here. He was a wanderer now, a man searching for a way to quiet the ghosts of the men he had killed and the comrades he had lost. His solitude was a physical weight, a second skin he wore over his buckskins. Miles away, in a world fenced in by timber and propriety, a young woman felt a different kind of solitude. Abigail Monroe was 22 years old, the daughter of Samuel Monroe, a man who had hammered a cattle ranch out of the unforgiving earth with his own 2 hands and the fear of God. Their ranch was a small kingdom of order in a world of chaos. White fences, a sturdy clapboard house, and a barn that smelled of hay and honest work. Abigail was the picture of a dutiful daughter. She managed the house with quiet efficiency, her hands as skilled with a needle as they were with a ledger. On Sundays, she gathered the handful of children from their ranch and the neighboring ones and taught them to read from the Bible. Her voice was soft, her manner gentle, and the settlers saw in her the promise of civilization, a delicate flower blooming in the dust. But inside Abigail, a wilder seed had taken root. She stood at the edge of her father's world and stared out at the vast, untamed horizon, feeling a hunger that had no name. She saw the distant mesas and felt not fear, but a deep and unsettling curiosity. The world her father had built was a cage, albeit a safe and comfortable one. She yearned for the unfenced spaces, for the stories the wind carried, for a life that was not measured in sermons and seasons of branding. Her dreams were a secret rebellion, a map of a territory she was forbidden to explore. She felt the thirst of the land in her own soul, a longing for a rain she could not imagine. Tawa Bodaway rode for Chinde Creek, in the tongue of his people. The name meant something akin to the river of ghosts or spirits, a place where the veil between worlds was thin. It was a sacred place, a ribbon of life that cut through the desolation. The elders said its waters flowed from the heart of the earth and carried the power to wash away the stains of violence, to soothe the fever of a haunted spirit. He was not a man given to flights of fancy. He had seen too much of the world's harsh reality, but the belief was a part of him, a sliver of hope he held on to like his last arrowhead. He needed peace. He needed to sit by a current of moving water and feel that some things in the world could still be cleansed. He needed to forget the metallic smell of blood and the final, surprised look in a man's eyes. He left his horse tied in a small grove of cottonwoods, the animal's presence a silent promise of return. He moved toward the sound of the water with the innate stealth of a hunter, his moccasins making no sound on the packed earth and stone. The creek was low, as it often was in the dry season, but the water ran clear and cool over a bed of smooth, multicolored pebbles. Sunlight filtered through the broad leaves of the cottonwoods, dappling the surface of the water with shifting patterns of gold. It was a place of deep tranquility. And for a moment, Bodaway felt the tight knot in his chest begin to loosen. And then he saw her. She was in the water, in a pool where the creek deepened just enough to allow it. Her back was to him, and she was unaware of his presence. He froze, not out of fear of being seen, but out of a profound, unbidden awe. His first instinct, honed by years of survival, was to melt back into the shadows, to leave her to her privacy. It was a trespass, a violation of this quiet sanctuary. But his feet would not move. He stood, hidden by the trunk of an ancient tree, and watched. Her hair, the color of corn silk, was piled atop her head, but stray strands had escaped to curl at the nape of her neck. The sun turned the water around her to liquid light, and her skin seemed to absorb it, to glow with a life he had forgotten existed. Her movements were slow, languid, as she used a piece of soap to lave her arms and shoulders. She was not a vision or a spirit. She was flesh and blood, a living, breathing creature in her most unguarded state. It was a scene of such simple, unadorned life that it struck him with the force of a physical blow. He saw the elegant line of her spine, the gentle curve of her shoulders. He watched as she leaned back, letting the water sluice over her, a small sigh of pleasure escaping her lips. A sound carried to him on the gentle breeze. His gaze was not one of desire, not in the simple way a man looks at a woman. It was something more elemental. He had spent years dealing in death, in the grim calculus of survival. He had seen bodies broken and life extinguished. What he saw now was the opposite of all that. He saw life in its purest form, vulnerable, beautiful, and utterly unaware of the darkness that so often surrounded it. The sight of her, so at peace in the very water he had sought for his own troubled soul, was a revelation. It was like seeing the first flower after a long, brutal winter. He went to the river for peace, but the woman bathing awoke a thirst no water could quench. The thought came to him, clear and sharp as an obsidian blade. It was not a thirst for water, nor a simple carnal longing. It was a deeper, more profound craving, a thirst for the life he saw before him, for the peace she embodied, for the beauty that could still exist in a world he had known only as cruel and unforgiving. She was a drink of cool water to a man who had forgotten he was dying of thirst. In that moment, she was everything he was not, clean, serene, and untouched by the violence that had shaped him. He knew he had to leave. To remain was an act of violation, a stain on the purity of the moment. With a will that took all his strength, he pulled his eyes away and backed away from the creek, his steps as silent as his arrival. He retreated into the trees, melting back into the landscape that had been his only true home. He collected his horse, his movements stiff and deliberate, his mind a canvas on which her image was now permanently etched. He rode away from Chindi Creek, the peace he had come for more distant than ever. He made a cold camp miles away, as the sky bled from orange to a deep, star-filled purple. He built no fire. He simply sat with his back against a rock and stared into the gathering dark. But he did not see the familiar shapes of the desert night. He saw sunlight on water. He saw the graceful curve of a woman's neck. He felt the echo of a thirst that burned in his gut, a fire that the cool desert air could not extinguish. He had faced down soldiers, bandits, and the brutal indifference of nature. He had known hunger, pain, and fear. But this new feeling, this strange and powerful awakening in the deadened landscape of his soul, left him restless and profoundly unsettled. Sleep would not come. He was a warrior, a survivor, a man of silence and shadows. And he had just discovered that his heart, which he had long thought to be a stone in his chest, was still terrifyingly, achingly alive. Abigail returned to the ranch feeling as if she were walking between two worlds. One was the sun-warmed world of the creek, a secret place of solitude and clean water that was hers alone. The other was this world, the one of duty, dust, and her father's unyielding gaze. She felt scrubbed clean, inside and out, and the familiar scent of the corrals and the dry earth seemed sharper, more potent. She slipped back into the routine of the house, her small rebellion a warm coal glowing within her. That evening, as the lamps were lit, casting long shadows across the wooden floors, a rider from a neighboring homestead arrived, his horse lathered and his face grim. He sat at their dinner table, refusing food but accepting a cup of coffee, his hands trembling slightly as he held the tin cup. He spoke in a low, worried voice. Comancheros, a band of them, a mix of outlaws and renegade tribesmen, had been seen near the borderlands. They were a plague on the territory, appearing like locusts to strip a place bare and then vanishing back into the wilderness. They were known for their ruthlessness, taking cattle, horses, and anything of value, and leaving behind only grief and ash. Samuel Monroe listened, his face hardening into a granite mask. He was a man built of the same unyielding material as the land he had conquered. His hands were thick and calloused, his back straight, and his eyes held the flat, watchful look of someone who expected the worst from the world and was seldom disappointed. He thanked the rider, who soon departed into the deep blue twilight, and then turned his attention to Abigail. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it held a weight that permitted no argument. You will not leave the immediate grounds of the ranch, Abigail. Not for your walks, not for anything. The Sunday lessons are canceled until I say otherwise. The world is not a safe place for a young woman to be wandering. I do not wander, Father, she said, her voice quiet but with a spark of defiance. I am careful. Care is a fool's armor against a bullet, he said, his words sharp. You will do as I say. Abigail lowered her eyes to the mending in her lap, her needle suddenly still. The warm coal of her secret afternoon by the creek turned cold. The fence that had always felt metaphorical, a boundary of rules and expectations, now felt entirely physical. Her father's protection was a lock on a door, and she was once again inside the cage. The vast, beautiful, dangerous world shimmering just beyond the bars. Miles away. Tawa Budaway was tracking the source of a thin tendril of smoke he had seen rising against the afternoon sky. It was a careless fire, too visible, and his instincts told him it meant trouble. He found what was left of a small, isolated homestead tucked into a shallow canyon. The cabin was a smoldering ruin. The small corral was empty. He found the bodies of a man and a woman, their lives taken with a casual brutality that made his stomach clench. A faint sound, a whimper, drew his attention to a thicket of mesquite bushes. Hidden inside, curled up like a terrified animal, was a small boy, no more than 7 or 8. His face was streaked with dirt and tears, and a nasty gash on his leg was bleeding sluggishly into the dust. The boy stared at Budaway with wide, frightened eyes, too scared even to cry out. Budaway approached slowly, his hands held open and away from his body. He knelt, making himself smaller, less of a threat. He spoke not in English, but in the soft, guttural sounds of his own tongue, a language of reassurance. The boy did not understand the words, but he understood the tone. Budaway then switched to the simple Spanish that served as a common language in these parts. I will not harm you, he said softly. I will help. He examined the boy's leg. The cut was deep, dirty, and would soon fester if not cleaned. He gently lifted the child, who was light as a bundle of dry sticks, and carried him to a place of shade. Using water from his own canteen and medicinal herbs he gathered from the canyon floor, plants his grandmothers had taught him to recognize. He cleaned and dressed the wound with practiced care. As he worked, the boy's terror began to subside, replaced by a flood of sorrowful words. He spoke of loud, cruel men on horseback. They had taken their 2 horses and the few chickens they owned. He had heard them talking as they ransacked the cabin, laughing as they did. They spoke of their next target, a big ranch, a place with many cattle, many horses. The name, the boy had heard it clearly. Monroe. The name struck Budaway like a physical blow. Monroe. He saw not a ranch, but sunlight on water. He saw not a white settler, a face among the many who had driven his people from their ancestral lands. But the woman from the creek. He gave the boy the last of his jerky and told him to stay hidden until the sun was high in the sky the next day. Then to walk east, where he would find another homestead. Then Bodaway stood, his mind a battlefield. He owed these people nothing. The white men, the Bilagana, had brought nothing but pain to the Dine. He remembered the stories of the long walk, when his people were forced from their homes, marched across hundreds of miles of desert to a reservation that was little more than a prison camp. He had seen the arrogance and the cruelty in the eyes of the soldiers, the settlers who looked at his people as if they were vermin to be cleared from the land. Samuel Monroe was one of them, a man who had put his brand on land that had once been free. Why should he risk his life for such a man? Why should he interfere? It was not his fight. But the image of Abigail returned, unbidden and powerful. He saw her serene face, her body glowing in the sunlit water. She was an emblem of a peace he craved, a life untouched by the blood and hatred that had defined his own. The Comancheros were vultures. He knew their kind. They would descend on that ranch, and they would not distinguish between the man who owned it and the daughter who lived there. They would defile and destroy everything in their path. The thought of their violent hands touching her, of that serene light in her being extinguished, ignited a cold, protective rage in him. It was a feeling that bypassed reason and history. It was primal. He was not saving a settler's daughter. He was protecting a vital, living thing from being consumed by the darkness. His hesitation vanished. He moved with purpose now, a predator on the hunt. He followed the trail left by the raiders, a path of broken branches and careless hoofprints. He read the signs in the dust, calculating their numbers, their speed, the tiredness of their horses. He moved parallel to them, a silent shadow in the rolling hills, keeping them in his sight as the sun began its long descent. Night fell, vast and starless, with a low ceiling of clouds that promised a coming storm. The Monroe Ranch was an island of light in the darkness, lamps glowing in the windows of the main house. Inside, Abigail sat reading, the silence of the house amplifying every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind outside. Her father and the two ranch hands were in the bunkhouse, oiling their rifles. The air was thick with a tension that felt like waiting for lightning to strike. It came not with a crash of thunder, but with a shower of flaming arrows. They arced through the blackness, thudding into the dry wood of the barn roof. Within moments, the hay inside caught, and hungry orange flames began to lick at the night sky. Shouts erupted from the bunkhouse, followed by the sharp crack of rifle fire. Abigail ran to the window, her heart pounding in her chest. Figures on horseback were circling the burning barn, their whoops and yells a terrifying chorus. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness, and she saw one of the ranch hands fall. Her father was shouting, firing from the cover of the bunkhouse door. The world had compressed into a nightmare of smoke, fire, and noise. The front door of the house splintered, kicked in by a heavy boot. Two men spilled into the room. They were rough, their faces obscured by grime and shadow, their eyes gleaming with a wild, predatory light. One of them grabbed her, his hand clamping over her mouth, his other arm a steel band around her waist. She struggled, kicking and twisting, but he was immensely strong. He dragged her out of the house, out into the chaotic yard. The heat from the burning barn was intense, and the air was thick with the smell of smoke and terror. She saw her father, his face a mask of fury, trying to get a clear shot, but another rider cut him off. Her captor threw her onto the front of his saddle, her body pinned against his. She felt the horse spin and then leap forward, carrying her away from the lights of her home, away from everything she had ever known, into the suffocating darkness. Just as they cleared the ring of light from the fire, an arrow whispered out of the night. It made almost no sound, but the man holding her grunted, his body going rigid. He slumped forward, the arrow protruding from his back, just below the shoulder blade. His grip loosened, and Abigail tumbled from the horse, landing hard on the ground. Before she could even process what had happened, a second arrow took another rider from his saddle. A third man, turning his horse with a curse, leveled his pistol toward the darkness where the arrows had come from. A shape detached itself from the deeper shadows. It was Tawa Bodaway. He moved with a fluid, lethal grace. He closed the distance in 3 silent strides. The raider's pistol fired, the shot loud and pointless in the night. Bodaway's knife flashed once, a silver arc in the firelight. The third man fell without a sound. The remaining raiders, seeing 3 of their own fall in a matter of seconds to a silent, unseen enemy, let out yells of alarm. Their greed was overcome by a sudden, superstitious fear. They fired a few wild shots into the darkness and then spurred their horses, melting back into the night from which they had come. Silence descended, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant, grieving shouts of her father. Abigail pushed herself up, her body trembling, her mind reeling. A figure stood over her. It was the Indian. He was tall and lean, a bow in one hand, a knife in the other. In the flickering, demonic light of the burning barn, he looked like a spirit of vengeance conjured from the earth itself. He reached down and pulled her to her feet. His grip was firm, not cruel but unyielding. He did not speak. He whistled softly, and his pinto horse trotted out of the darkness with an economy of movement. He swung into the saddle and then pulled her up behind him. "Take me back," she managed to say, her voice a choked whisper. "My father?" He ignored her, turning the horse not toward the ranch house, but away, toward the vast, dark expanse of the desert and the distant, jagged outlines of the mountains. "Please," she begged, finding her voice. "You have to take me home. Where are you taking me?" She felt him shake his head, a single, decisive movement in the dark. He urged the horse into a steady canter, putting the fire and the sounds of her old life behind them. A terrible realization dawned on her. She had been saved from one group of captors only to be taken by another. He was not her rescuer. He was her abductor. She was a prisoner, riding into an unknown wilderness with a silent, deadly stranger. Bodaway felt her terror in the rigid set of her body, in the frantic beating of her heart against his back. He did not know the words to explain that the ranch was no longer safe, that the raiders would be back, that her father and his guns were no match for their numbers and their cruelty. He did not know how to tell her that this, riding into the unforgiving sanctuary of the Navajo lands, was the only way to keep her alive, so he said nothing. He simply rode on, the conflict born in that moment as vast and as silent as the desert around them. He believed he was saving her life. She believed he had just stolen it. The world dissolved into a jarring rhythm of hoofbeats against hard earth. Abigail clung to the man in front of her, her cheek pressed against the rough texture of his buckskin shirt, the smell of dust and leather and something else, something wild and male, filling her senses. The night was absolute, a black wool blanket thrown over the world, and they were a single, moving point within it. Her initial shock gave way to a surge of frantic anger. She pushed against him, yelling over the sound of the wind and the horse, "Let me go! You must take me back!" Her words were torn away, useless things. He did not slow, did not turn, did not acknowledge her in any way. He was a part of the horse, a creature of the night, and she was merely baggage he was carrying. She beat a fist against his unyielding back, a futile gesture that accomplished nothing but bruising her own knuckles. He absorbed the blows as if he were made of stone, his pace never faltering as he guided the pinto through the darkness with an instinct she could not comprehend. They rode until the gray light of a false dawn began to outline the horizon, revealing a landscape of terrifying immensity. They were in a sea of rock and sand, a place that seemed to have been forgotten by its creator. He finally brought the horse to a halt in the lee of a rock formation that looked like a stack of giant, weathered bones. He dismounted in one fluid motion and then reached up for her. She recoiled from his touch, sliding off the other side of the horse, her legs trembling and weak as they met the ground. She faced him across the animal's back, her eyes blazing. "Why have you done this? Who are you? My father will come for me. He will bring men, many men." The Indian looked at her, and for the first time, she saw his eyes in the clear light. They were dark and deep, and held no malice, only a profound weariness. His face was a mask of planes and angles, carved by sun and hardship. He spoke, and his voice was low, rough, like stones rubbing together. The English words were deliberate, spaced as if he had defined each one from a great distance. "Your father is one man, they were many, they will return."
"He is not afraid, he will fight them."
"He will die," the man stated. It was not a threat, but a simple, unadorned fact. He turned away from her then, his attention on the horse, loosening its cinch, checking its legs. His dismissal of her entire world and the father who had been its center, was more galling than any threat. They did not speak again for hours. He gave her a strip of dried meat and a sip of water from his canteen, a ration so meager it seemed an insult. The sun climbed the sky, a merciless white disk that bleached the color from the rocks and baked the air until it wavered in shimmering waves. The heat was a physical presence, pressing down, stealing the moisture from her body, cracking her lips. She had known heat on the ranch, but this was different. This was the heat of an open forge, with no shade, no house, no well to offer relief. She felt her anger begin to bake away, leaving behind a brittle residue of fear. Everything here was designed to kill. The sun, the thirst, the silence, and the silent man who watched her with those unreadable eyes. By midday, the sky began to change. The brilliant blue was hazed over with a pale, yellowish tint that spread from the west. The wind picked up, no longer a gentle sigh, but a persistent, whining moan. It carried sand that stung her exposed skin and gritted between her teeth. Tawa Bodaway stopped. He scanned the horizon, his body taut. He said one word, "Storm." He led the horse into a narrow crevice between two massive boulders, a space barely wide enough for the animal. He pushed Abigail in after it, into the cramped, stifling space. "Sit," he commanded. "Do not move." He then pulled a heavy buffalo hide from his pack and, with a strength that surprised her, wedged it across the opening of the crevice, plunging them into near darkness. The sound came first, a low rumble that grew into a deafening roar, as if a great beast were dragging itself across the desert floor. The world outside their tiny sanctuary became a screaming chaos of wind and sand. The buffalo hide shuddered and bucked as the storm hammered against it. Sand, fine as flour, forced its way through infinitesimal cracks, coating everything. Abigail huddled against the warm, solid flank of the horse, her hands over her ears, convinced the rock walls around them would be scoured away to nothing. She could feel the man, bowed away, his back pressed against the hide, using his own body to help brace it against the incredible force of the wind. He was a silent, unmoving anchor in the heart of the maelstrom. The storm lasted for what felt like an eternity. When the roaring finally subsided, replaced once more by a profound silence, he pushed the hide away. The world they emerged into was changed. The landscape had been reshaped, the contours of the dunes softened, the rocks scoured clean, the air was thick with a brown haze, and the sun was a dim, copper coin in the sky. He looked at her, his face a mask of dust except for his dark eyes. He pointed to the canteen at her hip. "You have water." "It is almost gone," she said, her voice raspy. "We find more." He led her to a place where the storm had swept a rock face clean, revealing a dark, damp stain. He began to dig at the base of the rock with his knife and his bare hands. At first, it seemed a pointless, desperate act, but after a few minutes, the sand he scooped out was cool and dark. A few minutes more, and a small, muddy puddle of water began to seep into the hole. It was brown and bracked, but it was water. He let it settle and then scooped some into his hand, drinking it before gesturing for her to do the same. She hesitated, looking at the murky liquid. He watched her, his expression unchanging.
"Thirst kills slow," he said.
She knelt and drank. The water gritty and warm, but it was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. That night, he taught her how to make a fire. He gave her a small bow and a spindle, showing her how to hold the block of wood with her foot, how to draw the bow back and forth to make the spindle spin, creating friction. Her first attempts were clumsy, laughable. The spindle flew out, the bowstring tangled. She felt a flush of frustrated humiliation. At the ranch, a fire was a simple matter of a match and kindling. Here, it was a skill as vital and as difficult as breathing. Bodaway watched her without comment. He did not mock her. He simply waited. When she threw the drill down in exasperation, he picked it up and, with a few effortless pulls of the bow, a thin curl of smoke rose, followed by a glowing ember in the powdered wood dust. He tipped the ember into a small bundle of dry grass he had prepared and blew on it gently. A tiny flame flickered to life. She watched, mesmerized by the simple magic of it. He had created life from nothing but sticks and breath. The next day, he showed her a snare he had made from a length of sinew, a simple loop and a trigger made from a bent stick. He placed it on a rabbit trail, camouflaging it with dust and small leaves. They left it and moved on. Later that day, he found a long, dead snake, its bones bleached white by the sun. He picked up the delicate skeleton and, with his knife, carefully broke off a piece of the jaw. He worked it for a few minutes, sharpening the point, carving a tiny notch near the top. "A hook," he said, holding it out for her to see, "for fish." "Where there is no water?" she asked, the question sharp with sarcasm. He did not rise to the bait. He simply tucked the bone hook into a leather pouch. "Water comes, water goes, be ready." His patience was a thing of stone. It chipped away at her anger, eroding it grain by grain. Her hatred, so fierce and certain in the beginning, was becoming confused. This man was her captor. He had stolen her from her home, and yet he was also her teacher, her provider, her protector. He moved through this hostile world with a knowledge and a grace that was as natural as a hawk's flight. He read the land like a book she could not even open. He found water where there was none, knew where to find the driest wood, understood the habits of the unseen animals around them. That evening, they returned to the snare, and in it was a rabbit. He dispatched it quickly and cleaned it with his knife, his movements economical and without cruelty. He cooked the meat on a spit over their small fire. The smell of it roasting made Abigail's stomach ache with a hunger she had never known. He gave her a piece, and she ate it with her fingers. The hot, savory meat a balm to her soul. They sat on opposite sides of the fire as darkness fell completely. The flames danced, casting his face in flickering light and shadow. He was cleaning the small snake jaw hook with a strip of leather, his attention completely focused on the task. She watched him, really seeing him for the first time. The stories she had heard all her life painted men like him as savages, as mindless, brutal heathens. But there was nothing mindless about the intelligence in his eyes, nothing brutal about the gentle way he had tended the tiny flame, nothing savage about the quiet dignity with which he moved. He was not the monster from her nightmares. He was a man, alone and weary, doing what was necessary to survive, and he was doing what was necessary to keep her alive, too. The realization settled over her, not with a crash, but with a quiet, profound clarity. He looked up then, as if feeling her gaze, and their eyes met across the fire. The animosity had leached out of her expression, replaced by a raw, unguarded curiosity. He held her gaze for a long moment, and in the depths of his eyes, she saw not a captor, but a man carrying his own heavy burdens. She lay down on the sandy ground, pulling her thin shawl around her shoulders for warmth. She was exhausted, but her mind was alive, replaying the events of the last few days. She had been torn from her world, thrown into a nightmare, but in that nightmare, she had seen things, learned things. she never could have imagined. She had felt the raw, terrifying power of the earth and had witnessed the quiet strength of a man who was a part of it. She fell asleep, and she did not dream of the fire and smoke of the attack. She did not dream of her father's ranch. She dreamed of a river. She was standing in the cool, clear water, the sun warm on her skin. It was the same creek, her secret place, but it felt different. It was no longer just a place of escape. It was a destination. The water flowed around her, clean and cleansing, and in the dream, she felt a powerful, undeniable sense of hope, a feeling that the river was not behind her, but somewhere ahead, waiting for her. And she was no longer afraid. She was thirsty. They traveled for another 2 days, moving deeper into a territory of towering red rock formations that rose from the desert floor like the monuments of a forgotten race of giants. The land became more broken, a labyrinth of canyons and dry washes where a man could disappear forever. Tawa Bodaway moved through it with an unerring certainty, his pinto picking its way over trails that were invisible to Abigail's eyes. Her body had hardened to the rhythm of the horse, her mind to the constant, watchful silence. The world of her father's ranch, with its fences and routines, now felt like a distant dream, a life lived by someone else. Just when she thought the endless rock and sun would be her entire world, he turned the horse into a narrow, shadowed canyon she had not even seen. The temperature dropped immediately, the air cool and smelling of damp stone and pine. They followed the winding path for nearly a mile, the canyon walls rising hundreds of feet on either side, until it opened abruptly into a small, hidden valley. Abigail gasped. It was a pocket of impossible life in the middle of the desolation. A small spring trickled from the base of the canyon wall, feeding a grove of cottonwood trees and a patch of impossibly green grass. Wildflowers, splashes of yellow and purple, grew in defiant clusters. The valley was a secret, cupped in the palm of the great red cliffs. Tucked under a massive overhang of the cliff, so perfectly situated that it seemed grown from the rock itself, was a small dwelling. It was a hogan, she vaguely recognized from stories, a simple structure of mud and timbers, but it was sturdy and solid, its rounded walls echoing the shape of the surrounding landscape. A small, well-tended patch of corn and squash grew nearby, irrigated by a painstakingly constructed channel from the spring. It was a home. His home. He dismounted and finally, after days of tethering her to him with his presence, he offered her a kind of freedom. He gestured to the small valley. "You can walk here. There is water, food." She looked at the sheer, unclimbable walls of the canyon. Walk where? He seemed to understand her unspoken question, the mix of hope and fear in her voice. He looked at the narrow opening through which they had entered, then back at her. His gaze was steady, not threatening, but filled with the weight of an undeniable truth. "If you leave," he said, his simple English carrying the full gravity of his meaning, "the desert will kill you before I find you." It was not a threat, it was a promise that he would look for her, and a statement of fact about the land that was now her jailer. She understood. Her cage was no longer his presence, but the vast, lethal beauty of the wilderness itself. The days that followed settled into a quiet, strange domesticity. He gave her a space in the hogan, a pile of soft furs to sleep on. He was a creature of routine and silence. He rose before the sun, greeting the new day with a quiet chant she could not understand, his voice a low hum that seemed to be a conversation with the stones and the sky. He would then disappear for hours, returning with a rabbit or a brace of quail, or sometimes nothing at all. Left alone, Abigail explored her small world. She found a flat, sun-warmed rock by the spring where she could wash her face and hands, a small luxury that felt like a return to civilization. She watched him work. She saw him sit for an hour, chipping away at a piece of flint with a deer antler, his concentration absolute, until he had fashioned a perfect, lethal arrowhead. She saw him check his snares, his movements patient and precise. One afternoon, she saw him standing on a high ledge, his face turned to the sky. A great golden eagle was circling high above, its cry a lonely, piercing sound. Bodaway made a soft, clicking sound in his throat, a call that was both strange and beautiful. The eagle dipped a wing in its flight, as if in answer, before soaring away over the canyon rim. He spoke to it like an old friend, a confidant who shared the secrets of the sky. He had a canvas sheet, and on it, with charcoal from the fire, he drew horses. They were not the placid, well-fed animals from her father's ranch. They were creatures of spirit and motion, all flowing manes and powerful muscles, their eyes wild and free. He drew them from memory, from his soul, and they were more alive on the canvas than any horse she had ever seen. Her fear of him had long since evaporated, baked away by the desert sun. Curiosity had taken its root, and now, watching him in his own home, a new feeling was beginning to blossom, a quiet, unsettling admiration. He was not just a survivor. He was a part of this world in a way she could not comprehend. He lived in a state of grace with the harshness of the land, never fighting it, but moving with its rhythms, listening to its language. The deep scar on his ribs, the one she had first noticed days ago, had begun to look inflamed. He had been favoring that side, his movements stiffer than usual. One afternoon, he returned from a hunt empty-handed, his face pale and tight with pain beneath its sun-darkened surface. He sat heavily by the fire, his breathing shallow. She saw a trickle of fresh blood staining the side of his buckskin shirt. Without thinking, she went to the spring and soaked a strip of clean cloth she had torn from her petticoat. She knelt beside him.
"Let me see,"
she said, her voice soft. He looked at her, his eyes wary, a flicker of the wild, untamed animal in his gaze. He had kept her alive, but he had never shown a moment of weakness. To allow her to tend to him was an act of trust he had not yet offered. She did not wait for his permission. Gently, she lifted the edge of his shirt. The wound was angry and red. The stitches he had likely made himself pulling at the skin. It was weeping and needed to be cleaned. She took a deep breath, pushing aside any lingering fear, and began to carefully clean the injury with the damp cloth. He sat perfectly still, his body rigid, but he did not pull away. She worked in silence, her touch as gentle as she could make it. She saw other scars on his body, old and white, a road map of a violent life. When she finished cleaning the wound, she found his small pouch of medicinal herbs, the ones he had used on the boy in the canyon. She crushed some of the leaves as she had seen him do and made a poultice, applying it to the inflamed skin. He watched her face the entire time, his dark eyes searching hers, trying to read this new chapter in their story. When she was done, she pulled his shirt back down. His skin had been warm beneath her fingers. "Thank you," he said. The words were quiet, a concession. She sat back on her heels, the space between them filled with a new, fragile intimacy. "Why did you leave the fighting?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. He was silent for a long time, staring into the fire. She thought he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, heavy with memory. "I was a warrior," he said, looking at his own scarred hands. "Now, I only want peace." The simple, stark confession struck her with incredible force. It was a window into his soul, a glimpse of the weariness that lived behind his stoic mask. He was not so different from her. He, too, yearned for something beyond the life that had been assigned to him, a life of violence for him, a life of confinement for her. From that day on, something between them shifted. The silence was no longer empty, but filled with a quiet understanding. They began to work together. He showed her which plants were good to eat and which were poison. She learned to grind corn on a flat stone, her movements growing more practiced and efficient. They moved around the small camp in a silent, unconscious dance, anticipating each other's needs. When he went to check his snares, she would follow, watching and learning. A subtle trust was being built, woven from shared tasks and unspoken reliance. One evening, they sat by the fire, the desert sky a brilliant tapestry of stars. The air was cool and still. It had been weeks since the attack on her father's ranch, weeks since her life had been irrevocably altered. She felt a strange sense of peace in this hidden place, a feeling that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. She looked at him, at the strong, quiet man who had become the center of her new existence. The memories of her past life felt thin and fragile, like old letters. She remembered her dream of the river, the thirst she had felt. It was all tangled up with this man, this place.
"The first time you saw me," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "at the creek, what did you think?"
He stopped his work, his hands going still. He did not look at her, but stared into the dancing flames, his profile etched by the firelight. The memory was there, in the sudden tension in his shoulders, in the way his jaw tightened. He had been a ghost that day, a silent observer. And now she was asking him to give that ghost a voice. He turned his head slowly and met her eyes. His gaze was intense, holding all the raw honesty of the wilderness around them. He did not embellish, did not soften the words. He gave her the simple, unvarnished truth. He said, "I thought that no water could quench the thirst you awoke." The words fell into the silence, as potent and as real as the heat from the fire. It was more than a confession. It was the naming of the powerful, unspoken thing that had been growing between them in the dust and the firelight. It was the story of his own restless soul, a thirst for peace, for life, for something he had seen in her that day, something he had risked everything to protect. Abigail could not speak. She could not move. She could only look at him, her heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm in her chest. The fear was gone. The anger was a distant memory. All that was left was the staggering, terrifying, and beautiful truth of his words, reflecting the very same truth that was blooming in her own heart. They sat in the profound silence of the canyon, under the indifferent stars, and both of them understood that nothing would ever be the same again. The silence that followed his words by the fire was not empty. It was a space filled with a new and delicate architecture of feeling, a structure built of shared hardship and a single, devastatingly honest confession. In the days that followed, Abigail found herself watching Tawa Bodaway not as her captor, nor even as her protector, but as the man who had confessed a thirst only she could awaken. The knowledge of it was a constant, humming presence between them, changing the very air they breathed. Their hidden valley, which had once felt like a prison, now seemed a fragile sanctuary, a world created just for two. But the outside world had not forgotten them. Its ghosts were hunting. Bodaway grew more watchful, the deep stillness in him replaced by a heightened, predatory alertness. He began to spend more time near the narrow entrance to their canyon, his eyes scanning the distant mesas. One day he returned from a patrol, his face grim. He held out his hand. In his palm lay a spent rifle cartridge, its brass casing still bright. It was not the kind used by the army. It was favored by traders and outlaws. "Comancheros," he said, his voice flat. "They search for me." The word sent a chill through Abigail despite the heat. These were the men who had burned her home, the men from whom he had saved her. Now they were a persistent threat, a shadow stretching toward their peaceful world, their motive a simple and brutal one, revenge. There was another ghost as well, one born of love and fear, Samuel Monroe. Her father, Abigail knew him. She knew his iron will, his stubborn refusal to yield to any force on earth. She knew he would not be sitting and waiting. He would be riding, his face a mask of grief and fury, convinced his daughter had been stolen by a savage. He would gather men, trackers, anyone who would follow him, and he would scour the territory. His posse was a force of righteousness in his own mind, a tide of justice that would, she feared, drown everything in its path when it finally found them. 2 hunting parties, one driven by vengeance and the other by a terrible misunderstanding, were closing in. In a small leather satchel that had been tied to her saddle the night of the attack, a bag she had completely forgotten, Abigail found a small, cloth-bound journal and a stub of a pencil. It was a relic from her past life, a place where she had recorded Bible verses and observations on the weather. Now, sitting in the shade of the great red cliff, she opened it. Her fingers felt clumsy holding the pencil. What could she possibly write that could describe this new life? The first words were hesitant. She did not write about being a prisoner. She wrote about the way the sun turned the canyon walls to fire at dawn. She described the taste of water pulled from the sand, the way Bodaway moved without sound, the focus in his eyes as he chipped at a piece of flint. She wrote of the horses he drew with charcoal, how they seemed to gallop off the canvas. She described him not as a savage, but as a man who spoke to eagles and read the story of the land in a broken twig or a displaced stone. She wrote of his patience, his quiet strength, and the deep, abiding weariness she saw in his eyes when he thought she was not looking. Her journal was no longer a record of a settler's life. It was becoming the secret testament of a woman seeing the world and her own heart for the very first time. The fragile piece of their sanctuary was a bubble, and she knew it. The tension grew with each passing day. He became more nocturnal, sleeping for short periods during the heat of the day and spending the nights keeping watch, a silent guardian at the mouth of the canyon. The quiet intimacy they had found after his confession was strained by the constant, unspoken threat. One night, the air was unusually cool, and a sliver of a moon hung in the inky sky. The fire crackled, a lone point of warmth and light in the vast darkness. He had been staring into the flames for a long time, his thoughts 1,000 miles away. Abigail watched him, her heart aching with a feeling she could no longer deny, a complex brew of compassion, admiration, and a deep, tender affection. She gestured to a series of geometric patterns woven into the old blanket he kept around his shoulders. "What do these mean?" she asked softly, wanting to pull him back from the dark place his mind had gone. He touched the woven wool, his fingers tracing one of the lines. "It is a story," he said. "It is the story of the Den, of my people." "Tell me," she urged. He was silent for so long that she was sure the conversation was over. But then he began to speak, his voice low and devoid of emotion, as if he were reciting a history learned by rote, a tale so steeped in pain that feeling had long ago been burned out of it. He spoke of a time before, when his people had lived in a place of great beauty, a land between sacred mountains. They had been rich, not in gold, but in sheep and horses, in family and stories. The land was their mother, he said, and they lived in harmony with her. Then he spoke of the soldiers, the Bilagana, who came with flags and papers, men who saw the land not as a mother but as a thing to be owned, to be cut into squares with fences. He told her of the wars, the broken treaties, the slow, relentless pressure that pushed his people into smaller and smaller corners of their own world. He told her of the final, terrible chapter, the forced march in the dead of winter, the long walk to a place called Bosque Redondo. He spoke of the hunger, the cold, the children and the elders who fell by the trail and were left for the coyotes. His voice grew even quieter. "At this prison," he said, "they tried to make us into white men. They took our children and sent them to schools where our language was forbidden. They took our men and cut their hair." He touched his own long, black hair, which he kept tied back with a leather thong. "For the dying," he said, "our hair is a part of our spirit. To cut it is to try and kill the soul. They brought their priests, their black robes. They wanted to wash away our beliefs." He looked at her, and for the first time, a flicker of a deep, ancient anger showed in his eyes. It was a baptism by gun. He said, "Believe, or be erased." The story settled in the air between them, a thing of immense weight and sorrow. It was the history of his scars, of his solitude, of the profound weariness he carried. It was the reason he only wanted peace. Abigail felt tears welling in her eyes, hot and shameful. She saw not a warrior, but a man from a proud and wounded people, a survivor of a grief so vast she could not comprehend it. The stories she had heard of savage Indians and manifest destiny curdled in her soul. Turning to Poison, she began to weep, silent tears that traced paths through the dust on her cheeks. "I am so sorry," she whispered, the words inadequate, foolish. But all she had. She was not just apologizing for herself, she was apologizing for her father, for the soldiers, for the settlers, for the relentless, unthinking cruelty of her entire race. He looked at her, his expression softening. He reached out, not to touch her, but as if to prove the gesture was possible. "It is not your fault," he said. "You did not hold the scissors. You did not carry the gun. But it was her people, and in that moment, the chasm between their two worlds was closed by the simple, powerful bridge of her tears. The love she felt for him deepened, transforming from a tender, romantic notion into something fierce and protective. The limits of her old morality, the rules of her father's world, seemed like foolish, flimsy things in the face of such profound human connection. A few days later, she found him standing on the ledge where he spoke to the eagle, looking out over the vast, empty landscape. He looked trapped, a free spirit confined to this small pocket of safety. Hunted from all sides. The injustice of it overwhelmed her. He had saved her life. He had protected her, taught her, and shared the deepest wounds of his soul with her. He deserved more than this life on the run. She walked up onto the ledge and stood beside him. The wind gently stirred her hair. He did not look at her, but he knew she was there. His presence was a solid thing beside her. She reached out her hand, slowly, hesitantly, and laid her palm against the side of his face. His skin was rough from the sun and wind, his beard a slight scratch against her fingers. He flinched at the unexpected contact but did not pull away. He closed his eyes. It was the first time she had ever touched him with deliberate tenderness. The act was more intimate than a kiss. He turned his face slightly, his cheek pressing into her palm. She looked at his strong, proud profile, the lines of pain and endurance etched around his eyes. "You deserve to live," she said, her voice thick with an emotion she did not try to hide. Not just hide, you deserve to live in the sun. As the words left her lips, a small movement on the distant canyon rim caught her eye. It was high above them, a dark shape against the brilliant blue of the sky, a silhouette, a man on a horse, motionless, watching. The world snapped back into sharp, terrifying focus. Their sanctuary had been breached. The ghosts of the past had found them. The single dark shape on the canyon rim was a violation. It shattered the fragile peace of their world. A punctuation mark of death at the end of Abigail's whispered sentence. Tawa Bodaway's hand, which had been resting near his side, was suddenly holding his knife. The movement so fast and fluid, it seemed the blade had simply appeared there. The tenderness in his face vanished, replaced by the flat, hard mask of the warrior she had first seen in the light of the burning barn. He grabbed her arm, his grip like iron, and pulled her from the ledge. "Get inside," he said, his voice a low, urgent command that allowed no argument. "Stay away from the opening." He moved with a coiled, lethal energy she had not seen since the night of the attack. He was no longer the quiet man who drew horses and spoke to eagles. He was a hunter who had just become the hunted. He kicked dirt over their small fire, extinguishing the last of its smoke. He grabbed his bow and a quiver of arrows, his movements economical and stripped of all hesitation. The sanctuary had become a trap. Abigail scrambled into the dark. Earthen interior of the hogan, her heart hammering against her ribs. The single watcher on the rim was a terrifying omen. But the transformation in Bodaway was almost as frightening. It was a stark reminder of the violent world that lay just beyond the canyon walls, a world he had tried so hard to leave behind. Outside, The sky was beginning to change. The brilliant, pitiless blue of the afternoon was being consumed by a bruised, purple underbelly of cloud moving in from the west. The wind, which had been a gentle whisper, began to moan. A low, mournful sound that echoed off the canyon walls. A storm was coming. It felt as if the sky itself were reflecting the sudden, violent turn of their fate. Bodaway stood concealed in the rocks near the canyon entrance, a motionless silhouette against the darkening stone. Abigail watched from the shadows of the hogan, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. The lone rider on the rim had disappeared, but she knew he was not gone. He was a scout. The wolves were gathering. The first drops of rain fell, fat and heavy, spattering against the dry earth and raising the clean, sharp scent of dust. The wind grew stronger, driving the rain in stinging, horizontal sheets. The world dissolved into a gray, roaring chaos of wind and water. Night fell early, a premature and absolute darkness swallowed by the storm. Thunder cracked overhead, a sound like the sky splitting open, and for a moment, a flash of lightning illuminated the canyon, freezing the scene in a stark, blue-white tableau of whipping trees and streaming rock faces. It was in the next flash of lightning that she saw them. They were at the mouth of the canyon, a group of riders, their shapes dark and menacing against the electric glare. They were not Comancheros. These men sat their saddles with a grim, purposeful stiffness, even from a distance. Through the curtain of rain, Abigail recognized the determined set of her father's shoulders on the lead horse.
"Father,"
she whispered, the word a prayer and a curse. A voice, not her father's, cut through the roar of the storm, a name carried on the wind. Abigail. It was Silas. Silas Blackwood, a young rancher from the neighboring valley. A man her father had approved of. A man whose earnest, clumsy courtships she had politely deflected for the past year. He represented everything she had left behind, a world of church socials, Sunday dinners, and a predictable, fenced-in future. The sound of his voice, of that old life intruding on this new one, was a physical shock. A rifle shot answered him, the sharp crack distinct from the rumble of the thunder. It was not Bodaway who had fired. The shot came from the search party, a nervous man firing at a shadow. The bullet ricocheted off the canyon wall with a high, whining scream. Abigail felt a sudden, sharp sting in her shoulder, a searing heat that was instantly followed by a wave of numbness. She cried out, stumbling back, her hand flying to the spot. Her fingers came away wet and sticky. It was not a direct hit, but a shard of rock. A piece of the bullet itself had torn through her sleeve and into her flesh. In the next instant, Bodaway was on her, a blur of motion in the dark. He threw her to the ground behind a low wall of rock near the hogan, his body covering hers completely. He was a living shield, his weight pressing her into the wet earth, the smell of rain and ozone and his own fierce resolve filling her senses. Above them, the night exploded into a hell of noise. Rifle fire echoed through the narrow canyon, the shots deafeningly loud. Bullets slammed into the rock around them, chipping off fragments that flew like angry insects. Bodaway did not move, did not make a sound, simply absorbed the impact of the storm of lead and rock, his body a solid wall between her and the violence. She could feel the tense, coiled power in his muscles, the steady, controlled rhythm of his breathing against her back. He was waiting. He did not fire an arrow. In the blinding rain and the treacherous wind, his bow was useless. He lay still, letting the posse expend their ammunition and their rage. His mind a cold, calculating machine in the heart of the chaos. The men moved forward into the canyon, taking cover behind rocks, their shouts barely audible over the storm. They were pinning him down, trapping him in his own home. Abigail could feel the warm blood seeping from her shoulder, a slow, steady pulse that seemed to count out the final seconds of their lives. She was terrified, but a strange, fierce clarity cut through her fear. She knew, with an absolute certainty,
that she would rather die here with this man than return to the life Silas Blackwood represented. One of the men, bolder than the rest, broke cover and ran toward the hogan. In a single, explosive movement, Bodaway was up and moving. He was not a man anymore. He was a desert predator, a creature of pure, deadly instinct. He met the man's charge with a speed that was impossible to follow. Abigail saw the glint of his knife, a brief flash of lightning reflected on steel. The man made a choked, gurgling sound and fell. Another man, Silas, saw his companion fall and let out a yell of rage. "Abigail! He is a killer!" Silas stepped out from behind a boulder, leveling his rifle. Bodaway did not hesitate. He had the fallen man's pistol in his hand. He fired once. The sound of the shot was flat and ugly. Silas staggered backward, a look of profound surprise on his face. He dropped his rifle and crumpled to the ground, a dark stain spreading across the front of his shirt. The world seemed to fall silent. The remaining men in the posse, seeing two of their own fall in a matter of seconds, fell back, their confidence shattered. Even the storm seemed to hold its breath. And then, a single figure walked forward into the open space before the hogan. His rifle held steady. It was her father. Samuel Monroe's face was a terrible thing to see in the flickering, uncertain light. It was carved with grief and an incandescent fury. All he saw was the dead body of the young man he had hoped would be his son-in-law, and the savage who had killed him, standing over the body of his daughter. He raised the rifle, the barrel aimed squarely at Tawa Bodaway's chest. "It is over," Samuel roared, his voice breaking with anguish. "You will not touch her again." Bodaway did not move. He stood, the pistol still in his hand but held loosely at his side. He did not raise it. He simply stood and waited, his face unreadable, his fate in the hands of the man whose world he had destroyed. It was then that Abigail moved, pushing herself up, ignoring the searing pain in her shoulder. She stumbled into the space between the two men. She stood directly in front of Bodaway, her back to his chest, facing her father down the barrel of his rifle. She was trembling, soaked to the bone, blood staining her dress, but her eyes were clear and steady. "No," she said, her voice not loud, but carrying over the sound of the wind and the rain. "Abigail, get away from him," her father pleaded, his voice cracking. "He is a murderer. He has bewitched you." She shook her head, the rain plastering her hair to her face. "He saved me. Father, he has done nothing but keep me alive." "You call this living?" Samuel gestured wildly at the canyon, at the dead men on the ground. "This is savagery. Come home." A profound, sorrowful certainty settled in Abigail's soul. She looked at her father, at the man who had been her entire world, and she knew that world was gone forever. She could not go back. She could not unlearn the things she had learned, could not unfeel the things she now felt. She took a deep breath. "Father, if I go with him, you can hate me," she said, her voice clear and strong, each word a stone laid on the foundation of her new life. "But I cannot live in a world where justice only belongs to the strong." Her words hung in the air, a truth so powerful it seemed to shake the very rocks around them. She was not just talking about Bodaway. She was talking about his people, about Silas, about her father's rigid, unbending laws. Samuel Monroe stared at his daughter, at the woman she had become. He saw not a frightened captive, but a person making a conscious, deliberate choice. He saw the unwavering conviction in her eyes, and in them, he saw that he had already lost her. The fury in his face crumbled, replaced by a look of utter, soul-crushing defeat. His hands trembled, the rifle barrel wavered. Slowly, with the weight of a lifetime of certainty crashing down around him, he lowered the gun. He did not speak another word. He did not offer forgiveness. He did not say goodbye. He simply turned and walked back through the rain, a broken man. His shoulders slumped. The remaining men of the posse followed him, dragging the bodies of their fallen comrades. Their retreat, a silent, grim procession. When they were gone, an absolute silence descended on the canyon, broken only by the soft, steady sound of the falling rain. Tawa Bodaway slowly let his hand, the one holding the pistol, fall to his side. He stepped forward and gently took Abigail's arm, his touch supporting her as a wave of dizziness and pain washed over her. They stood together for a long moment in the aftermath of the battle, two solitary figures in the immense, weeping darkness. Then, leaning on him for support, they turned and walked away from her father's world, away from the life she had known. They moved past the Hogan, deeper into the canyon, two fugitives leaving a life of bloodshed behind, their path forward lit only by the faint, uncertain hope of a new day. The rain continued to fall, washing the blood from the ground, turning the red earth to mud, mingling their pasts in the dark, thirsty soil. They left the canyon at a grueling pace, Bodaway leading the pinto on foot to spare the animal, with Abigail swaying weakly in the saddle. The rain had stopped, but the storm had washed the world clean, leaving behind a sky of bruised purple and a desert that gleamed with a strange, wet light. Every rock and cactus seemed sharper, more defined, as if the land itself had been brought into painful focus. They did not look back. Their small home, their secret valley, was now a place of ghosts and blood, a memory tainted by the violence of the outside world. To look back would be to acknowledge the price of their choice, and they did not have the strength for that. They could only look forward, into the vast, unforgiving expanse that was their only refuge. By the second day, the sun had returned with a vengeance, beating down on them, turning the damp earth into a cracked and steaming griddle. The pain in Abigail's shoulder had subsided into a dull, throbbing ache. But a new, more insidious enemy was taking root, a fever. It began with a chill that made her teeth chatter despite the oppressive heat. Her skin felt hot and dry to the touch, and the world began to lose its sharp edges, blurring into a wavering, dreamlike haze. She lost track of time. There were long stretches of a jolting, agonizing rhythm, and then periods where Bodaway would lift her from the saddle and she would lie in a sliver of shade, his cool hand on her forehead. He would press the canteen to her lips, and she would drink the warm, metallic tasting water without protest. Voices drifted through her delirium, her father's, shouting her name, Silas Blackwood's, his face a mask of surprise, and another voice, a low, steady hum that was not a memory, a sound that was both a song and a prayer. Bodaway knew the signs. He had seen the fire of infection consume strong men in a matter of days. He pushed them onward, his face a grim mask of resolve, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for a place to hide, a place to heal. He found it late in the afternoon of the third day, a dark slash in the side of a low mesa, a shallow cave carved by wind and time, its mouth screened by a thicket of thorny mesquite. He carried her inside, into the cool, dark stillness. The cave was not deep, but it was shelter. He laid her gently on his bedroll, and then he went to work. He cleaned her wound again, his touch impossibly gentle. The flesh around the injury was swollen and angry. He gathered plants she did not recognize, crushing their leaves between two stones to make a dark, pungent poultice which he carefully applied to her shoulder. As twilight bled across the desert, her fever climbed. She began to shiver violently, her body caught in a war with itself. Bodaway built a small, smokeless fire just inside the mouth of the cave. He sat beside her, bathing her face with a damp cloth, and then he began to sing. It was not a song in any way she understood. It was a chant, a low, guttural melody that rose and fell with the rhythm of a human heart. The words were in the Navajo tongue, ancient and powerful. It was not a song for her ears, but for her spirit. It was a Hogan song, a song of healing, a plea to the holy people to restore balance, to walk the patient back into beauty. He sang of the sacred mountains, of the pollen path, of the life-giving rain. His voice was a current of sound in the small cave, a thread of ancient strength weaving itself into the fabric of the night. He was not just a warrior tending a wound. He was a medicine man calling on the power of his ancestors. sharing the deepest part of his soul to try and save hers. Abigail drifted on the river of that sound. It was an anchor in the terrifying, feverish sea of her delirium. She floated in a space between worlds, and in that space, she was not afraid. She awoke to silence. The fire was a bed of soft, glowing embers. The fever had broken. Her body felt weak, hollowed out. But her mind was clear, lucid. She was lying on her side, and Tawa Bodaway was asleep, sitting propped against the cave wall, his head on his chest. His rifle lay across his lap. Even in sleep, he was a guardian. She lay still, watching the soft rise and fall of his chest, her heart filled with a gratitude so profound it felt like a physical ache. He had pulled her back from the edge of a great darkness. He stirred, his eyes opening instantly, alert and watchful. When he saw she was awake and her eyes were clear, the tension in his shoulders eased. He gave her a small sip of water, and then a piece of cooked rabbit he had saved. She ate slowly, her strength returning with each bite. They stayed in the cave for several days, a quiet, peaceful interlude in their flight. They spoke little, but the silence was a comfortable one. The silence of two people who no longer needed words to understand one another. She watched him, learning the landscape of his face, the quiet grace of his hands. He watched her, seeing the life and color slowly return to her cheeks. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the shadows dancing on the cave walls, a morbid but necessary thought entered her mind. She looked at him, at the man who was now her entire world, the man who had fought for her, who had healed her with his hands and his spirit. "If I had died," she asked, her voice quiet but steady, "where would you have buried me?" He did not look away. He did not offer a comforting lie that she was never in danger. He accepted the question with the same stark honesty with which he lived his life. He considered it for a moment, his gaze distant, as if seeing a place far beyond the cave walls. "At the place where the river begins," he said. His answer was so unexpected, so deeply poetic, that it took her breath away. It was not a description of a grave, but of a genesis. The river, Shind Creek, the place where he had first seen her, where the thirst had awoken in him. To be laid to rest at its source would be to return to the beginning of their story, to consecrate the ground where their two disparate lives had first flowed together. His words were not about death. They were a promise of remembrance, a vow that her life and her meaning to him would be honored at the very source of its inspiration. It was the most profound declaration of love she could possibly imagine. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, but it was not a tear of sorrow. It was a tear of overwhelming, heartbreaking beauty. The love she felt for him was no longer a secret, tentative bloom in her heart. It was a living, breathing thing, as real and as vital as the air in her lungs. She felt a sudden chill, a tremor of weakness from her recovery, and she shifted closer to the fire. He saw the movement. Without a word, he moved from his side of the fire to hers. He sat behind her and, for the first time, he put his arms around her. It was not a passionate embrace. It was something far deeper. It was the quiet, unconditional surrender of two weary souls. She leaned back against the solid wall of his chest, feeling the steady, reassuring beat of his heart against her back. His arms held her with a strength that was purely protective, a gentle caging that felt not like a prison, but like the safest place in the entire world. She closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of wood smoke and leather and the clean, wild scent that was uniquely his. This was the first time they had held each other without fear, without the chaos of battle or the urgency of escape. It was a simple, profound coming home. Their love had not burst into flame like a wildfire on the prairie. It had grown slowly, quietly, like a deep, underground spring, nurtured by shared hardship, by silent understanding, and by a thirst that had finally found its river. In the quiet shelter of the cave, two people who had been running their entire lives finally stopped and found their refuge not in a place, but in each other. The next morning, as the first light of dawn painted the eastern sky, Abigail looked at him. "We cannot stay here," she said. He nodded. He knew. They were too exposed, too close to the world that was hunting them. "Where will we go?" she asked, though in her heart, she already knew the answer. He looked at her, and his eyes held the memory of her question from the night before, and the quiet power of his answer. "There is only one place," he said. "We will go back to the river." Their journey back to the river was a pilgrimage in reverse. They were not traveling away from a known world into a frightening unknown, but returning to the source, to the only place that felt like a beginning. The desert itself seemed to be in concert with their newfound hope. The harsh, baked tones of the landscape began to soften. A late winter rain had washed the dust from the air, and now, as the days grew longer and warmer, a fragile, impossible green was emerging. It was a faint blush on the hillsides, a fuzz of new life in the sheltered washes, a testament to the land's patient and enduring will to live. Tawa Bodawe's Pinto, a mare of incredible stamina and heart, began to slow. Her belly, which Abigail had not paid much mind to, was now round and heavy. She was carrying a foal. The knowledge of it, of this new life they carried with them, felt like a sacred trust, a symbol of the future they were daring to build. They traveled slowly, resting often, their small caravan a picture of quiet domesticity against the vast, epic landscape. When they finally saw the familiar line of cottonwood trees that marked the course of Chindi Creek, it felt like a homecoming. The river was fuller now, fed by the melting snows from some distant, unseen mountain range. It ran swift and clear, its voice a happy, gurgling sound that was the antithesis of the desert's profound silence. This was the place. The water that had awakened a thirst, the water that had haunted her dreams. They made their camp on a grassy bank, a short distance from the pool where he had first seen her. That first evening, they simply sat and listened to the river, a shared, silent prayer of thanks. The next morning, Bodaway walked the length of the bank and found what he was looking for, a place where the earth was rich with clay. And so, they began to build their home. It was not a house of timber and nails, of rigid lines and fences. It was a wickiup, a simple, sturdy structure of willow branches bent into a dome and plastered with a thick layer of mud mixed with grass. They worked together, their movements falling into an easy, unspoken rhythm. He cut and set the strong branches, his knowledge of the wood's tension and strength innate. She mixed the mud with her bare hands and feet, laughing as the cool, wet earth squelched between her toes, a simple, sensual pleasure that would have been unthinkable in her old life. They were like two children, creating not just a shelter, but a world. In the days that followed, their life took on a gentle, tidal rhythm, governed by the rising of the sun and the flow of the river. The Pinto mare gave birth to a long-legged, clumsy foal, its coat the same patchwork of brown and white as its mother's. The foal was a constant source of delight, a symbol of their new, fragile peace. Their education of one another began in earnest. Abigail's ears, so long attuned to the sharp consonants of English, struggled with the soft, flowing sounds of the Navajo language. The Dine Bizad. He was a patient teacher. He would point to the water and say, "Tu." He would touch a stone and say, "Tse." He taught her the word for beautiful, Nijoni, and she heard him whisper it one evening as he watched her brushing her hair in the firelight. The word she came to love most was hosho. He tried to explain it in his simple English. It did not just mean beauty, he said. It meant balance, harmony, walking in a state of grace with the world. It was the foundation of his entire being, and she felt it settle into her own soul, a concept more profound than any sermon she had ever taught. In return, she taught him from the only book she had, her small journal. He knew some English words, enough to survive, but he did not know how to read or write the strange, angular symbols that held the sounds. She would draw a letter in the smooth sand by the riverbank, and he would copy it. His large, calloused hand surprisingly deft, his brow furrowed in concentration. One afternoon, she wrote a single word: freedom. He looked at the shape of it for a long time, as if it were a talisman from a foreign land. Free, he said, sounding out the first part. He understood the concept as a physical state, not being in a cage, not being on a reservation, but the way she said the full word, the reverence in her voice, suggested something more, a state of the soul that he had only ever known in fleeting moments. He picked up a piece of charcoal and, on a smooth, flat stone, he copied the letters Freedom. It was the first word he ever learned to write. He kept the stone, a heavy, solid piece of his new education. Their idyllic peace was a bubble, beautiful and fragile, and they both knew, in the quiet moments, that the outside world had not simply forgotten them. The bubble burst one afternoon with the arrival of a lone Navajo shepherd, an old man driving a small flock of sheep down to the river to drink. He shared their fire and their food, and he shared his news. He spoke to Bodaway in their own tongue, a long, somber conversation. Abigail, who could now understand fragments, heard the words for soldiers, Bilagana, and a name, Killer of White Men. The old man's eyes were filled with a sad pity as he looked from Bodaway to her and back again. When he left, a heavy silence descended over their small camp. Bodaway did not look at her. He stared across the river, his shoulders set in a line of unbearable tension. "The army is looking for me," he said, his English stark and empty of all the softness it had held just an hour before. "They are telling people I stole a white woman and murdered the men who came for her. They have put a price on my head." The words hung in the air, cold and sharp. The world they had built, the peace they had found, was built on a foundation of sand, and the tide was coming in. Bodaway had been a warrior, a renegade, a ghost, but now he had a new name, a name that would be on the lips of every bounty hunter and soldier in the territory. That night, he did not sleep. He sat by the fire, sharpening his knife, checking his arrows, his face a hard, impenetrable mask. The tenderness was gone, banked like a fire against the coming storm. Abigail lay in the wickiup, her heart a cold stone in her chest, listening to the gentle sounds of the river, a sound that now seemed to mock their stolen peace. In the gray light of dawn, he came and knelt beside her. His face was filled with a terrible resolve. "I am going to leave," he said. "I will ride to the nearest fort. I will turn myself in." "No," she whispered, the word catching in her throat. "They will not stop hunting as long as I am with you," he continued, his voice low and firm, as if he were explaining a difficult but necessary truth to a child. "If they find us here, they will kill me, and they might harm you. If I go to them, they will have what they want. They will have their killer. You will be safe. You will be free." His words were a knife in her heart. She sat up, her eyes blazing with a fierce, protective fire he had never seen before. Safe, free. She grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his flesh. "My safety is here. My freedom is you. Do you not understand that there is no life for me back there? Not anymore. I will not let you do this. I will not let you sacrifice yourself for a life I do not want." His face was a mask of anguish. He truly believed he was doing the right thing, the only thing that could save her, and she saw in his eyes that he was prepared to leave, with or without her blessing. A wave of desperate, frantic terror washed over her. She scrambled out of the wickiup and ran to the riverbank, to the very edge of the flowing water. She fell to her knees in the soft, damp earth, the place where he had taught her to write his new favorite word. She did not know the words of his healing chants. She did not know the names of his holy people. She could only turn to the God of her own past, the stern, patriarchal God of her father. She clasped her hands together, a gesture she had not made in months, and she began to pray. Her prayer was not the soft, memorized plea of a Sunday school teacher. It was a raw, ragged cry from the depths of her soul. She did not ask for forgiveness or for guidance. She begged, she bargained, she demanded, "Do not take him from me," she whispered, her tears falling freely now, splashing into the river and being carried away by the current. "He is a good man. He is a gentleman. He has only ever known war and sorrow. He deserves peace. He deserves a life. Please, I will do anything, give up anything, but do not take him from me." Bodaway had followed her. He stood behind her, a silent witness to her desperate, heartbreaking prayer. He listened to her defend him to the God of the people who had hunted him. He saw the woman who had once despised him now kneeling in the dirt, offering her very soul in exchange for his life. And in that moment, he finally understood. He understood that her freedom was not a place she could return to. It was a state of being that existed only with him. To surrender himself would not be to free her, but to imprison her in a world of grief. He knelt beside her, his presence solid and comforting. He put his arm around her, and she collapsed against him, her prayer dissolving into sobs. He held her, his own heart aching with a love so fierce it was a physical pain. He looked from her tear-stained face to the flowing water of the river. "If freedom is a crime," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before, "then I accept being jailed, as long as you are free." She looked up at him, her eyes searching his. His words, meant to comfort, were still a vow of sacrifice. He still did not fully see that his cage would also be hers, but in his eyes, she saw not just resolve, but a flicker of doubt, a question. He had made his decision, but her desperate prayer had shown him the terrible, unintended consequences of his noble act. And in that flicker of doubt, Abigail saw a tiny, desperate glimmer of hope. They were not defeated yet. Their fragile truce with fate lasted less than a week. It was a patrol of cavalry, their blue uniforms a jarring slash of color against the landscape. That found them. They did not come with guns blazing, but with a quiet, methodical efficiency that was somehow more terrifying. They had followed the tracks of the old shepherd's flock back to the river, a simple piece of tracking that Bodaway, in his distraction, had overlooked. He saw them first, of course. He was mending a fishing line by the water's edge when his head snapped up, his body going utterly still. Abigail, who was grinding corn on a flat stone, saw the change in him, and her heart froze. There was no escape. The land around the river was too open. To run would be a futile gesture, an invitation for a bullet. Bodaway stood up slowly, his hands held open and away from his body. He did not reach for his knife or his bow. His only thought was for her safety. A violent resistance would only serve to prove their narrative, that he was a killer, and she was his victim. The soldiers, a half-dozen of them led by a young, grim-faced lieutenant, rode into their small camp, their horses kicking up the soft earth. The lieutenant's eyes took in the scene, the simple wickiup, the small fire, the half-finished cornmeal. His gaze fell on Abigail, her dress patched and worn, her face browned by the sun, but her eyes clear and unafraid. He had expected to find a terrified, brutalized captive. He had not expected to find a home. "Tawa Bodaway," the lieutenant asked, his voice tight. Bodaway gave a single, slow nod. "You are under arrest for the murder of Silas Blackwood and another man, and for the abduction of Miss Abigail Monroe." Abigail scrambled to her feet. "Abduction? He did not abduct me. He saved my life." The lieutenant ignored her, his eyes fixed on Bodaway. "You will come with us." "I will come," Bodaway said, his voice calm. "On the condition that she is not harmed. She will ride with me." The journey to Fort Grant was a slow, humiliating procession. Bodaway's hands were bound in front of him. The reins of his pinto looped around the lieutenant's saddle horn. Abigail rode behind him, her hand resting on his back, a small, defiant gesture of solidarity. The soldiers rode in a tight formation around them, their faces impassive. They passed a few scattered homesteads, and the settlers came out to stare, their faces a mixture of fear, hatred, and a morbid, unholy curiosity. They saw a savage and his captive. They did not see two people whose world had just been shattered. The fort and the dusty, raw town that had grown up around it was a shock to Abigail's system. After months in the profound silence of the desert, the noise was a physical assault, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the rattle of wagon wheels, the coarse laughter from saloons, the constant, meaningless chatter of people. It was a world of sharp angles, of wooden sidewalks and false-fronted buildings, a world that seemed determined to impose its own rigid, ugly order on the land. They put Bodaway in the guardhouse, a small, windowless box of sun-baked adobe. They treated Abigail with a clumsy, condescending kindness, offering her a room in the commander's house and the loan of a dress from his wife. She refused. "I will stay where he stays," she said, her chin set. They would not allow it, of course, but her refusal to play the part of the rescued victim sent ripples of confusion through the small, rigid society of the fort. The trial was a spectacle. It was held in the town's largest building, which served as a saloon by night and a hall of justice by day. The room was packed with miners, ranchers, soldiers, and their wives, all of them hungry for a diversion, for a piece of the drama. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, cheap perfume, and self-righteousness. A circuit judge, a man with a tired face and eyes that had seen too much of the frontier's brutal calculus, presided over the proceedings. The prosecutor was a young, ambitious man from the East who saw this case as a stepping stone. He painted a lurid picture for the jury of 12 grim-faced ranchers. He spoke of a savage beast, a renegade who had preyed upon a helpless, civilized woman, stealing her away from her loving father and her intended husband. He brought forth witnesses from her father's posse who described the scene in the canyon, the bodies of their friends, the Indian standing over Abigail with a gun in his hand. They conveniently left out who had fired first. The narrative was simple, powerful, and clean. It was a story the jury wanted to believe. When Abigail was called to the stand, a hush fell over the room. She wore the simple, buckskin dress Bodaway had made for her. Her face was calm, her hands steady as she took the oath. "Miss Monroe," the prosecutor began, his voice dripping with synthetic sympathy, "tell the court how this man, this savage, dragged you from your home." "He did not drag me," she said, her voice clear and carrying to every corner of the room. "He saved me. The Comancheros had set fire to our barn. They were carrying me off when he appeared. He fought them. He saved my life." A murmur went through the crowd. The prosecutor's smile tightened. "So you went with him willingly into the wilderness for months?" "I went with him because my home was no longer safe. I stayed with him because I had no one else." "And what of Silas Blackwood? An upstanding young man. Did you not see this renegade cut him down in cold blood?" "I saw Mr. Blackwood and my father's men ride into his home with their guns firing. They shot at us in the dark. I was wounded." She touched her shoulder, where the scar tissue was still tender beneath the buckskin. "Tawa Bodaway did not fight back until he was trapped. He did what any man would do to protect his home, and to protect me." The prosecutor scoffed. "Protect you, Miss Monroe? Are you telling this court that you are not a victim, that you prefer the company of this killer to your own kind?" Abigail looked not at the prosecutor, but at the 12 men in the jury box, at their hard, closed faces. She saw that her words, the simple truth, were not enough. They could not hear her. They could only see the color of her skin and the color of Bodaway's, and the vast, unbridgeable gulf of prejudice that lay between them. They needed more than words. They needed to see her choice, not just hear it. She stood up. The judge banged his gavel, but she ignored him. In her hand, she held the knife that Bodaway used for carving, a tool she had tucked into her belt before entering the courtroom. Before anyone could react, she gathered her long, blonde hair, the hair her father had always called her crowning glory, into one hand. With a single, sawing motion, She cut it off. The thick, silken rope of hair fell to the dusty floorboards. The room was utterly silent. The act was a shocking, brutal declaration. She had shorn herself of the most potent symbol of her old life, of her white womanhood. It was an act of mourning and an act of rebirth. She then reached down and pulled on a pair of simple, beaded moccasins she had carried with her, replacing her worn leather boots. She stood before them, a woman transformed. Her hair cropped short and uneven, her feet clad in the footwear of the dine. She was no longer Abigail Monroe, the rancher's daughter. She was something new, something they could not categorize, and therefore could not dismiss. She turned to the judge, her eyes burning with a fire that eclipsed the prosecutor's cheap theatrics. "If he is a criminal," she said, her voice ringing with the force of an oath, "then I am his accomplice. If he is guilty, then I am guilty. What you do to him, you must also do to me." The townspeople were in an uproar. Some looked at her with open disgust, others with a dawning, reluctant admiration for her courage. She had irrevocably crossed a line, and there was no going back. The trial was on the verge of collapsing into chaos when a new witness was called, a man who had not been on the prosecutor's list. He was an older Navajo man, his hair streaked with gray, wearing the worn blue trousers of an army scout. He introduced himself as Kla. He had served the army for 20 years, his words spare and direct. Kla had been part of the patrol that investigated the Comanchero raid on the Monroe Ranch. He had found the bodies of the raiders Bodaway had killed. He described the arrows, the placement of the bodies, the tracks. His testimony, delivered in a mixture of Navajo and blunt English, was that of an expert. It was not a kidnapping, Kla stated, looking directly at the jury. It was a rescue, a fight. The tracks showed the woman was taken by the raiders, and that this man, Bodaway, had intervened. But what of the other two men, the men in the canyon, the prosecutor demanded, trying to regain control? Kla's gaze was withering. "I know Bodaway," he said. "I fought beside him, and against him, many years ago. He is a warrior. He does not kill for sport. But if you corner him, if you threaten what he protects, he will finish the fight." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "It is the way of the dine. It is also the way of any soldier." His testimony was a stone of fact dropped into a pool of rumor and prejudice. He was one of them, a man who wore their uniform. And he was vouching for the enemy. The jury, for the first time, began to look uncertain. The verdict, when it came, was a compromise born of a deeply confused frontier justice. Tawa Bodaway was found not guilty of abduction and not guilty of the murder of Silas Blackwood, the court accepting it as an act of self-defense, but he was found guilty of the manslaughter of the other man, the first man to charge him. For this, he was sentenced to time served and banished from the territory under penalty of death. He was to be escorted to the border and released. He was free, but he was in exile. As the courtroom emptied, Abigail looked for her father. She had seen him in the back of the room, his face a stone mask, watching the entire proceeding. But he was gone. She found a small, folded piece of paper left on the bench where he had been sitting. It was a note, written in his familiar, blocky script. It was not addressed to her. It was simply a statement. If freedom makes you happy, then live for it. That was all. No anger, no forgiveness, just a stark, painful acceptance. It was his final act of letting her go, the only blessing he knew how to give. She clutched the note in her hand, the last piece of her old life, and walked out into the sun to find the man who was her new one. The soldiers escorted them to the territorial border, a meaningless, invisible line drawn in the dust. The young lieutenant, his duty done, looked at Abigail one last time. His expression a mixture of confusion and a grudging respect he could not quite conceal. He said nothing, simply gave a curt nod, turned his horse, and led his men away, their blue uniforms shrinking against the vast red landscape until they were gone. They were alone. The silence that descended was immense, a physical presence that was no longer threatening, but cleansing. They were exiles, banished from a world that had no place for them. But for the first time, they were truly free. They had no destination, no posse on their trail, no past to answer to. There was only the horizon, and the long road that led toward it. They rode through the rest of the day and into the night, the pinto and her foal keeping a steady, tireless pace. The stars emerged, a brilliant, cold fire scattered across a black velvet sky, more stars than Abigail had ever imagined. She rode beside Tawa Bodaway, their shoulders occasionally brushing, a small point of contact in the immense darkness. She clutched her father's note in her hand, the sharp edges of the paper a final, painful link to the life she had left. She had not shown it to Bodaway. It was a private grief, a quiet absolution that she needed to hold for herself. She had not been abandoned. She had been released. And in that release, she found not sorrow, but a profound and aching gratitude. Bodaway was silent, his profile a stoic carving against the starlight. He was a man without a tribe, banished from the land of his ancestors, a land he was now forbidden to set foot on again. He had lost everything he had ever known. But as he looked at the woman riding beside him, her short hair a soft halo in the moonlight, her face tilted up toward the endless sky, he knew he was not a man who had lost his home. He was a man who had finally found it. They rode toward the great, sleeping shapes of the mesas, and as the night began to thin, a pale gray line appeared on the eastern horizon. They stopped on a high ridge, the perfect vantage point from which to witness the birth of a new day. Below them, the colossal sandstone buttes of Monument Valley stood like silent, eternal sentinels. The sun rose. It was not a gentle dawning, but a magnificent, theatrical explosion of color. The sky bled from deep indigo to violet, then to a soft rose, and finally to a brilliant, searing gold. The light struck the tops of the great mesas, setting them on fire, the red rock glowing as if lit from within. The long, sharp shadows of the night retreated, and the entire world seemed to be washed clean, remade in the incredible, pristine light of the first morning. A light rain had passed through in the night, and the air was filled with the clean, earthy smell of wet sand and creosote. Abigail breathed it in, a scent that was now as familiar and as comforting to her as the smell of baking bread had once been. She turned to Bodaway, her face illuminated by the golden light, her eyes shining with a wonder so pure it was almost painful to behold. "I never thought freedom smelled like rain on sand," she said, her voice soft with awe. Bodaway looked away from the sunrise and at her face, and he saw a beauty that eclipsed even the magnificent spectacle before them. He had spent his life believing freedom was a thing to be fought for, a piece of land to be reclaimed, a right to be wrested from an enemy. He had been wrong. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his calloused thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "Freedom is not a place," he said, his voice quiet, but filled with the certainty of a man who had finally discovered the world's most profound truth. "It is the person you choose to stand beside." Her eyes filled with tears, but they were not tears of sadness. They were the overflow of a heart that was simply too full. She leaned into his touch, a silent and complete affirmation of his words. They sat on their horses, two small figures on a high ridge, and watched the day be born. Their pasts burned away in the glorious, cleansing fire of the sunrise. They knew where they were going. There was no need for discussion. Their destination was not a place on a map, but a place in their souls. They turned their horses and began the long journey back toward the river. When they arrived, it was as if they had never left. The Wickiup stood, a humble and solid testament to the life they had started. The river flowed, its voice the same constant, reassuring murmur. A pair of golden eagles, the same ones he had spoken to from the ledge, now circled high overhead, their vast wings catching the morning sun, their piercing cries a welcome and a blessing. They were home. They dismounted by the water's edge, letting the pinto and her foal drink from the clear, cool current. Abigail knelt and dipped her hands into the water, splashing it on her face. It was a baptism, a conscious washing away of the dust and blood of the trial, a reclamation of this sacred place. Bodaway stood beside her, watching. He took the flat stone from his pouch, the one on which she had taught him to write his first word. He looked at the angular, foreign letters F-R-E-E-D-O-M. He had carried it as a talisman, a reminder of what he fought for. Now, he understood it was not a goal to be achieved, but a life to be lived. Every day, in the quiet moments. He no longer needed the symbol. He had the truth of it standing beside him. With a gentle, deliberate motion, he tossed the stone into the river. It made a soft splash and disappeared, returning to the earth, its lesson learned. He knelt beside her, and they looked down at their own reflections in the moving water. They saw a man and a woman, one with skin the color of the red earth, the other with skin the color of cream, one with hair as black as a raven's wing, the other with hair cropped short, the color of corn silk. They were a study in contrasts, two worlds colliding, but as they watched, the current of the river stirred their images, the sharp lines blurring, the colors bleeding into one another, until the two distinct reflections merged and became a single, shimmering whole, inseparable from the light of the rising sun and the flow of the water. The cycle was complete. The thirst that had been born in this river had finally, truly been quenched. Not by the water, but by the love that had been forged in the heart of the desert, a love that had taught them both how to forgive and how to be free. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like this video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.